Okay, hello everyone. Thanks for clicking on this recording. Here talking to you is Mara Baudena. I am currently at the National Research Council of Italy in Turin, and I was previously and I'm still affiliated with the Copernicus Institute of Sustainable Development. And with me is Rubén Díaz, professor at the Universidad Nacional de Educación and Distancia in Madrid, and also affiliated with the Copernicus Institute there in Utrecht. So we are, hi Rubén.
Hi, hi everyone.
So we are here to talk to you about biodiversity and about disturbances, and we're gonna have a project where we are gonna use spatially implicit high-dimensional models. And I'm gonna start giving you briefly a motivation. Biodiversity, as you probably know, is declining at unprecedented rates. If you're talking about plants, we have projected losses up to 25% in 2050 relative to 1995. And this can have impacts that are important for people because biodiversity is connected to yield and to soil quality, but also inversely to disease prevalence. And after decades of research, actually the mechanisms driving biodiversity in general and plant community diversity are actually not so clear. A lot could be said about this, but there's no time, so I leave it there for biodiversity. And I want to introduce the fact that one important factor for diversity in plants are disturbances in general, and more specifically, we have been working together with Rubén and others and thinking about fires a lot. Fires and vegetation are actually closely interconnected. Plant characteristics determine whether fires occur or not, and fires have effects on vegetation, of course, which burns, so there's feedbacks and the systems are quite complex. So the interplay between disturbances and the plant dynamics can generate different levels of biodiversity and have different effects on communities' composition. And this said, I hand it over to Rubén.
Thanks, Mara. So this relationship between biodiversity and disturbance is summarized in a very well-known hypothesis, the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, which, in order to understand it, we can think about plants or species need to maximize the use of resources, and it depends on the environment and the interaction they face. They need to have strategies. So if we don't have much disturbance, then the environment is just fighting for resources and space. So there's a few strategies that you can use to use better the, let's say, water and light, and occupy the space and disperse among the space. So then there's a few strategies, there's a few biodiversity, few types of species with these strategies. But if you introduce disturbance, not very frequent and not very with not very high impact, then there's more strategies available. How do you deal with how you cope with a fire? You resist it. If you after the fire you're able to regrow, then with this combination there's more room for biodiversity, for strategies some higher biodiversity. Of course, if disturbances are too high, let's say too frequent or have a large extent, then the only important strategy is to deal with fires. So biodiversity also goes down. That's the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, that in intermediate disturbances, biodiversity is maximum. Next. Yeah. So this is a very well-known hypothesis, and there's a lot of publications about it, some of them very well cited. And our challenge is to approach it mathematically. Next. So how we do that? We use a competition-colonization model, which works with data ideas. So the species, well, let's say that we divide the space into small patches, and the species can occupy each patch, and they compete for the occupancy of that patch. So we have species that are good in taking resources, let's say water and light. So whenever they arrive to a patch, they outcompete the others. These ones are the one in top in with a low number. The best one is the species one. And there are other species that are fast in colonizing, so going to empty spaces. These are the bottom species there, the third species. And in between, you can find different combination of strategies. So in that way, we can model how many patches are occupied by the species, as we see in the graph as they evolve towards a steady state of occupancy. Next. So this model has been already used to test the intermediate disturbance hypothesis. And what this paper in 2001 did was to introduce disturbance as a mortality rate term. So he considered, the author, that disturbance increases mortality, the average mortality, and in the test he found that the model and the way of modeling was consistent with the hypothesis. Next. But some criticisms have been made to this approach, mainly that perturbations are not very well approached by a constant rate. Particularly fires are a pulse perturbation. They occur in a certain moment of time, but then it doesn't occur for a long time. So how this changes the relationship with biodiversity is what we want to study. Next. So what we do is we use a very similar approach using the same type of equation almost all the time, but at specific points in time, fires or perturbations occur that take out that empty some patches, so dynamics is somehow restarted. So here you see a simulation of that. Next. We have done this type of approximation with much complex models in type of perturbation. They are stochastic, or they depend on the biomass. This is an example in the Mediterranean case with 3 species. And some results we are working on and ready to publish. We'll see. Next. But what we want to do in this challenge is to go not for 3 species, but for a network with many species. So in order to understand how these hypotheses work for these systems, we need to make a lot of simulations or try a better, more intelligent approach using some analytical results and let's say the topology of the interactions. So we don't have an analytical criteria to know when species are going to coexist and have high diversity, but we do have one criteria for when one species can survive in certain conditions and when 2 species can coexist or not. So what we want to do is to go from this 1 and 2 species criteria up to understand what happens in a higher dimensional case. Next. So that's the challenge. We have the input we have explained, the problem of the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, a model to do that, and an analytical tool to simulate how mainly fires work. And we want to understand if diversity increases with perturbation with the 2 characteristics of pulse perturbation, the frequency and the extent of the perturbation for high dimensional systems, and how this depends on the functional diversity and certain traits of the species, the colonization rate, the mortality, or the recovery rates after fires. This might not be as too difficult. We have an idea, but we haven't worked it out fully. So we may have time to go for a little bit more complex systems with stochasticity, or where the period between fires depends on the species. They have a feedback. That we can go for more complex problems if this works. And we also can wonder if where else this model can be applied aside from fires to work different examples. So that's our challenge. I hope you find it interesting, and we are here to explain whatever you want to ask.
Yes, we will be there for the question hour. See you there, hopefully.
See
Bye.
you. Bye.